This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting this week's shows is Katelyn McCullock, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, with a cattle market update. She describes box beef cutout as an incredible market. Jeff Whitworth, K-State Extension field crop entomologist, continues the show as he shares information about bean leaf beetles. Soybean producers may want to scout their fields for this crop insect. Rounding out this Monday's show is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken, explaining how bugs end up in puddles and if people should be concerned about them. He also notes that mosquitoes are going to start being more prevalent. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. We begin this Monday, as we usually do, with a cattle market update. And then to give it to us this week, we have the Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. Katelyn, thanks for joining us again.
Well, thanks for having me, Shelby.
So the first portion of the cattle market we're going to talk about today is the cash cattle market.
Well, the cattle markets have been on fire, as most of you probably are aware. Friday's daily 5-area average hit just over 186 and has been holding that level fairly strongly. So we've now repeaked again over that April number, which is very exciting on the fed cattle side. On the feeder cattle, things last week were a little bit more mixed. If you look at 5 to 6s, were a little bit higher than the previous week, hitting 285 in Dodge City. But some of the heavier weights, the 7 to 8s, were a little bit lower, slipping from about just over 230 the week before down below 230 in the last week. And so a little bit of mixed results there. In terms of box beef, the cash side of things closed Friday really strongly at $343 for choice and $310 for select. This has been an incredible market to watch as well. You know, just a week ago, we were closer to $332 on the choice side, so an increase of over $10 a hundred in 7 days. So pretty strong prices there as well.
And you mentioned things were kind of on fire a little bit, and is that because we're seeing that lower supply and higher demand, kind of what Daryl mentioned last week?
So the underlying fundamentals is largely going to be supply driven, but we have had this note of strong demand that has also pulled those cattle prices through. And so we got both sides of supply and demand hitting the cattle prices in the same direction right now, which is adding to price in a pretty aggressive manner. I think what we're going to be watching for, though, is post 4th of July sales. So what happens after we hit this big grilling holiday season, and do we see some relaxation in this boxed beef price? I don't expect it to be a large reset, but it wouldn't be out of the question to see that price come down some.
So maybe as we round out our summer holidays with the 4th of July, maybe seeing a little bit of change in the cattle market?
We have a little bit lower prices on the fed side and on the feeder side heading into summer. I think your feeder prices are going to be pretty sticky as long as it continues to rain, and there's a little bit of worrisomeness, I guess, with the dryness in the corn belt. But absent of that, I mean, the feed cost outlook looks good, and the demand from cattle feeders looks very strong, especially with such a strong fed cattle price out there. The margins are there to continue to pay for feeder cattle. The worry, I guess, would be how much does the fed cattle market reset here? You know, a couple of months ago, we would have said high 150s. I don't think you'll go that low in August this year. But, you know, is it closer to 170s like we saw earlier in the year, or maybe back even into the 160? I think that's possible. But again, I think what we have to watch is that boxed beef and how much the retailers are going to adjust their side of the margin situation too.
And Katelyn, another portion of that cattle market is future contracts. And so what are those looking like?
So the futures market for fed cattle have been pretty interesting. They're actually below where cash is. So most of the June through December contracts on Friday closed below 180. And so they're anticipating a little bit of lull in this market as well. So the August contract closed around 172 on Friday of last week. And I think that's a reasonable expectation now without necessarily weighing in all the pieces at the moment. But that seems pretty reasonable to me at this time. On the feeder cattle side, Friday closed higher up than the day before, and you have the fall contracts basically kind of flat October, November, and January, all about 240. And that's about where LMIC has their forecast. August looks about 234 at close on Friday, which is pretty similar to what the cash market was doing. So those seem relatively in line to me at this time.
And then something that you often like to talk about when you come on to talk about cattle markets is what the Consumer Price Index recently came out. And so what are we seeing with that?
So the Consumer Price Index is an economic measure of baskets of goods, and we like to use it because it's a easy way to talk about what's going on with inflation. And there's a couple different measures in here that I find interesting. So the one that the all items, which is a all-inclusive basket of goods, increased about 4% from last year. So quite a bit better than what we've been seeing. But I think a key point here is that the core inflation number, which doesn't include food and energy, is still up 5.3%. Still a big number on that side of things. And across the food space, that's the one that I particularly pay attention to. And meats actually only rose about 0.5%, which is similar to what it did last month as well. Probably the bigger shocks in the food space is that food in general is still up 6.7% compared to last year. Poultry is still up 2.1%, and dairy products still up 4.6%. And so even though we might be seeing overall prices come down, the necessity prices like food are still relatively quite a bit higher or increasing at a substantial rate relative to other inflation. And one of the big drivers of that all items index is going to be energy, which is down actually about 12%. So that's why that all items index versus core inflation is. So this is a number that the Federal Reserve looks at and has been looking at among other numbers when they're talking about whether or not to raise interest rates or to continue to raise interest rates. And one of the things they noted was that they're going to pause for the month of June, so not continuing to increase at the moment. But overall, the talking points that came out of the June Federal Reserve Committee meeting was that probably future increases are still ahead of us. And so as much as this might be a breather, it might be also fairly short-lived based on, what inflation and some other things are doing.
And then one other thing kind of dealing with prices is retail meat prices.
So as all part of that is going to be how do all the different meat cuts perform relative to each other, how much are consumers paying at that retail level. And on the show, we've talked before about different margins. So the retail margin, so the difference between what consumers pay and the wholesale value that the grocery store pays, that's actually a fairly wide spread right now relative to history. And so it's interesting to see those beef prices continue to climb and that margin's really hanging with that retailer as opposed to moving to the packer or moving further downstream. Now, the May number came in just under where the previous record high was. So for all fresh beef, that's all types, all cuts, the aggregate, price number was $7.50 a pound. And the previous record high was back in 2021 at $7.54, I believe. And so very, very close to that record high number. I think we'll see that hit maybe in June, maybe in July, but probably sometime this year will outpace that 2021 reference point. On just the choice beef, I believe that's already hit a new record high, up over $8 a pound for beef.
Katelyn, to kind of sum up everything we've talked about now for the cattle market, if you put a few key points out to producers, what would those be?
I think the national picture has a lot of nuances to it right now, especially when we're talking about weather, grass conditions, and drought. I'm in Denver, and we've gotten so much rain in the last month that it seems like a drought's broken, and that El Nino isn't just here, it's in full force. It's cold. Today's only 60 degrees. I turned on my heat last week again, which is a total anomaly for here in June. But that's a pretty different story than what maybe Nebraska and Kansas are still seeing, where it's still fairly dry and those pasture and range conditions maybe aren't picking up quite as much as they were. Texas and Oklahoma has both dryness and wetness right now. And so that's been something that you're trying to wrap your mind out around, even regionally. what is the outlook for this specific region. California is still very wet, a little bit drier maybe in the Pacific Northwest. And I mentioned the Corn Belt earlier too. On the crop side of things, Southeast, fairly dry for them as well. And that's not a region of the country that typically puts up hay. And so you may see some cattle movements that are still weather related, even though the drought to a large extent isn't nowhere even close to as bad as it was the last 3 years. And so those are the things we're trying to watch and keep our eye on, and it makes it a little difficult to say what should producers be watching. I think hay has been a big deal for the last 3 years, and I guess the thing I would watch is watch your grass levels, what your forage capabilities are. You know, is there a way to have hay on hand or add to your stock levels? Does that mean managing your pasture differently, et cetera? Because I think that is going to be what enables people to, if they're interested in expanding, to move quickly and kind of get ahead of that huge rush on what bred animals are probably going to do in the next couple of years. And so that would be my thought process. If there's anything you can do to kind of shore up that forward-looking plan at this point, that I'd be taking steps to do that.
Katelyn, I appreciate you coming on. And if people wanted to find out some more information from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, how could they do that?
They can go to www.lmic.info.
Thank you, Katelyn. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to do this today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. The link to the Livestock Marketing Information Center will be found in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're going to talk about bean leaf beetles with Extension Field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us once again.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
So, bean leaf beetles, why are we talking about them?
Bean leaf beetles are probably the number one soybean pest across the soybean growing parts of the United States overall. You know, more so this year, next year, it's just, they're kind of on and off, but every year we have bean leaf beetles all across the soybean belt in the United States. And they can affect soybeans in two different ways. First of all, a little of the biology of the bean leaf beetle. Bean leaf beetles overwinter as adults. So in the fall, they go into overwintering sites, and that can be, you know, bunch grasses or any place with a lot of residue that they can crawl in and out of the weather. So that's where they overwinter. As soon as the spring comes, as soon as the alfalfa breaks dormancy, they generally move to alfalfa and will feed a little bit in alfalfa. Not much, and they don't really cause any damage. And at that time of the year, there aren't that many of them. But as soon as those first little soybean plants start to germinate, the bean leaf beetles find them. I don't know how they do it, but man, they're really good at finding those first germinating soybean plants. Then they all fly there, migrate there, and they start feeding on the leaves. The bean leaf beetle adult has characteristic feeding damage. They leave oblong or oval holes in the leaves, unlike grasshoppers or some of the other things that are, you know, will eat around the edges and everything. The bean leaf beetle adult, it's really pretty unique, and generally they don't eat enough out of any one leaf to destroy the leaf, but they can do quite a bit of defoliation. Now, this is early in the season, as these right now, or the next week or two, as these soybean plants are germinating. A lot of times, you know, if it's hot, dry conditions, they're struggling. This leaf feeding can add a little more stress to them. In any case, a lot of times the growers are going around checking on their stand and their soybean stand. They see this leaf feeding, and they get pretty excited about it. In our experience and in our research over the last 30 years, we found that defoliating soybeans early on, especially in the vegetative stage, doesn't really impact the yield of the plant until you get over 50 to 60% defoliation. And that's of the entire plant, not of one leaf or, you know, one row in the field. That's of the whole field. So soybeans are really, really good at regenerating growth or or compensating for this early season feeding. Anyway, they will feed a little bit on the leaves. The adults don't feed that much this time of year. They're mainly interested in laying eggs. So the females then will lay eggs all around the base of the plants, in the soil, in cracks, crevices, all that kind of stuff. Probably 5 to 10 days later, those eggs will hatch. The larvae look, in my opinion, look exactly like corn rootworm larvae. They're white and they have a little brown spot at both ends. They feed on the roots. They crawl down into the soil and they feed on the roots or the root hairs of the soybean plant, just like a corn rootworm larva feeds on the roots or the root hairs of a corn plant. The easiest way to tell them apart without a microscope, now with the microscope you can tell them apart, but is if it's on a soybean plant, it's a bean leaf beetle larvae. If it's on a corn plant, it's a corn rootworm larvae. And I say that because, they follow corn and soybeans. There can be volunteer plants of each in each field, so sometimes people get them confused. The bean leaf beetle feed on the soybean plant. So early in the season, if you're out looking at your beans and you have a spot in the field that looks like it's not developing as well as the others, the growers like to say, I got a weak spot in the field, or the plants are looking a little more stressed, go out and pull up those plants and look at the roots. You'll probably see these little white larvae hanging off the roots or in the soil around them, because that's probably what's intercepting, the plant's ability to translocate nutrients. And generally they don't kill the plants, but they can set them back considerably, and so it's pretty noticeable. Generally, again, it's only a spot here and a spot there. It's not field-wide. This is early on. So then those larvae will pupate after 2 to 3 weeks, and the pupae will develop into adult bean leaf beetles. They will come up, and again, they will feed on leaf tissue, but we're looking at maybe mid-July to early August when these adults are coming out. The thing that is most worrisome to me, at least, is they will feed on the pods. The adult bean leaf beetle will feed on the pod, which, as you know, houses the marketable product, the seed or the bean inside. Mm-hmm. And so they open that pod up, and that can allow, desiccation or a pathogen or something to get to the bean inside. So they're feeding right on the yield part, the marketable product. So that can be a problem. They will feed on the green pods from whenever pod set is until October, or until they get ready to go into overwintering. Keep that in mind. That's the bean leaf beetle adult. They're feeding on the pods, and they will do that for the rest of the year. And I say that because later on in the year we will have problems with corn earworm larvae, and they're called podworms in soybeans. They will feed on the seed within the pod. So if you're scouting your field and you have pods with one hole right where the bean is, or 2 holes or 3 holes, and no scarring or feeding on the pod itself, that's a corn earworm larva. And generally speaking, they're only going to be out there feeding 2 weeks. And then they're going to pupate, and it's going to be another month before they're out there feeding. So it's really important as far as you identifying and distinguishing what's actually feeding on the pods at that time. But we're not to that point yet. We're still 2 months away from pod set.
So if people are wanting to go out in their fields and identify them, how can they do so?
There's 2 different color phases in Kansas, and there's a tannish green color phase and a red color phase. And the red color phase is often misidentified or confused with lady beetles, and the light green or tan phase is often misidentified or confused with southern corn rootworms, because they're all very common in soybean fields. But the bean leaf beetle is the only one that's going to do any damage. The bean leaf beetle adult, whether it's red or tannish green, they have 6 spots on the back and a black outline, a black border, or whatever you want to call it. And so they're really pretty characteristically colored, but they are about the same size as a southern corn rootworm or a 12-spotted cucumber beetle, which is the one that the green color phase can be confused with, and or the lady beetles. The southern corn rootworms can be out there in huge numbers, but later in the year, because they will be feeding on the pollen. They won't bother the beans or the pods. They'll just feed on the pollens. If they're out there now, they can feed a little bit on the leaf tissue, but they're not going to do any damage. So it's make sure, and I've had people spray for both lady beetles and southern corn rootworms just because they misidentified them, thinking they were in dire straits of having their crop ruined because of bean leaf beetle adults. But so that's why it's so important to make sure you identify. Also, as I said a little bit earlier, early on they'll do this time of year, they'll do leaf feeding or defoliation. It takes 50 to 60% defoliation to justify a treatment, or like maybe 7 adult beetles per row foot. It just, like I said, soybeans are really good at replacing the lost leaf tissue. It's just, I really have a hard time recommending spraying or treating for any defoliator early season in soybeans unless it's defoliating the crop 50 to 60%. Other than that, if it's less than that, just the crop will fix its own damage and you will never notice it on the yield.
So maybe taking a step back and seeing if it's worth it, but in your recommendation, more often than not, it's worth just waiting and using your resources later on.
Exactly. Now, those bean leaf beetles early on, like I said, is pretty noticeable because those plants are nice and green and succulent and they're growing and everybody likes to go out and see them. You see those holes in the leaves. They stand out quite a bit, but just don't get too excited. Don't get too quick to pull the trigger on an application because those plants are very resilient at compensating for that early season or vegetative defoliation.
Jeff, I think you've reiterated it once again, the importance of going out and looking at your fields. Is there a location in Kansas that producers should be extra concerned about?
Bean leaf beetles, like I said, are all over the soybean producing parts of the United States. And if you have questions as to materials or what to use for an application, you can consult our management guide, KSU Insect Management Guide for soybeans.
Jeff, I appreciate you coming on and giving us some more information about crop insects.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State Extension crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth with information about bean leaf beetles in your crops. If you would like to read more about this insect and other insects you might find in your field, you can do so in the Crop Insects in Kansas book, which you can find in the K-State bookstore. The link to that book will be found in today's show notes, which, as always, can be found on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken as he talks about bugs in puddles. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and on this Monday, we finish our show as we usually do with some wildlife information. And to do that today, we have K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Thanks for joining us again.
Yep, thanks for having me.
And today you wanted to talk about bugs and puddles. And so why are we talking about bugs and puddles?
Well, we're finally starting to get some rain around the state, which is fantastic. And, even though a lot of the state's still in drought, it's fun to see that rain. And when we get a good rainfall, which we've had some of recently, there are puddles around. And so over the weekend, I was walking with my 2 young boys around town. They love to jump in puddles. And so they stopped and were looking in there, and there were some bugs in there. And it got me thinking, hey, that might be a fun topic. So I thought we'd chat about seeing bugs in puddles.
How do those bugs get there?
It's really a neat little life cycle. And so a lot of these bugs, they lay their eggs in water. And those eggs hatch, and the larvae live in the water. And then they morph, much like a caterpillar into a butterfly. They morph into a terrestrial invertebrate, and they can leave that water and fly around. And so we have some really common examples. Mayflies, dragonflies have this life cycle. Probably the most common one that we know about are mosquitoes.
Are mosquitoes a concern when it rains and there's a bunch of puddles places then?
Anything that holds water is going to be able to raise mosquitoes, and their life cycle's pretty fast, but the eggs get laid in there. We all know mosquitoes bite us, and only female mosquitoes bite us, and they bite us because they need blood to have energy to make their eggs and lay their eggs. So that process of them biting us, then they go find some water, they lay eggs. And then those eggs hatch, and we have those aquatic larvae that live in the water. And we tend to think of them as a pest, but there are a lot of benefits to these invertebrates as well.
So I'm curious as to what are some of those benefits?
A big one is these aquatic invertebrates in the larval stages are a really big food source. And so there are a lot of fish, a lot of tadpoles, a lot of different organisms that will consume these larvae, and so they serve as a base of the food web in a lot of different systems. And, they look like kind of little worms to start with, but the different invertebrates have a lot of different fun characteristics. So if you go look at a bucket of water that's been sitting out, you'll probably see some little invertebrates that kind of tumble down through the water column, and that's a life stage of mosquitoes called tumblers. And a lot of fish love to eat those, and so fish will go gobble them up. A lot of energy. There's invertebrates that can live on wood and water, just a really good food source. Another big thing that the aquatic invertebrates do is they help to break down organic material. So if we think about leaves falling into our pond or into a river, there's certain invertebrates that kind of cut those leaves up into little pieces. There are other invertebrates that actually make little nets to catch pieces of debris. Detritus is what it's called, as it's drifting downstream or in a pond. And so breaking down that organic material, serving as a source for food and other organisms in our waters. So a couple really big good benefits there.
So not really a ton of concerns, not something people need to go out and put something in the little puddle so that they don't grow bugs.
No, so the bugs growing is a natural process, but how do they get there, right? That's a really big question. And so understanding that process. One thing that you might want to do, though, is, look around your property and figure out, are there areas that are holding water? Mosquitoes are a really big problem, which we're moving into that time of year where they are. Dumping out, an inch of water that a bucket might be holding, or tires are a really big one. If you have old tires laying around, they can collect water. Kind of any of your equipment that you can think of that it doesn't take much. If there's a little bit of water that an egg can hatch in and a mosquito can grow up in, anything you can do to dump those areas out might help your mosquito problem a little bit.
So hoping for rain in Kansas, but also being mindful of where standing water might be around your property.
Sure. We're not going to complain about the rain. I know quite a few farmers are going to be happy that we're getting some rain. So we're not going to complain about the rain. We don't need to really be worried about these invertebrates either, these bugs either. I just thought it was a fun topic to kind of chat about. And hey, where do they come from? What are they doing? And kind of mention some of the benefits as well. Mosquitoes get a bad rap, but they do have some benefits when we're talking about aquatic systems.
And if people want to find out more information, where could they do that?
Sure. So always reach out to your local extension agent. I think that's a great resource to start with. Entomological Society. So entomology is the study of bugs. We have a Kansas Entomological Society, and we have a national one. Those are both great resources. And as always, if you have a question about aquatics, feel free to reach out to me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more tomorrow.